Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that everything you've ever feared, everything you've clung to in life, was always rooted in a single, overwhelming misconception. The thought that keeps you up at night, the one thing that casts a shadow over all of your ambitions, relationships, and dreams, death. What if I told you that the very thing you fear most is something you should never fear at all? For centuries, we've been taught to fear death. It's been handed to us as an undeniable truth, an absolute certainty that looms over every moment of our lives, reminding us of the finite nature of existence. In every culture, in every religion, and in every corner of the human psyche, death is painted as the enemy. It's seen as the greatest threat to our happiness, the ultimate force that ends all that we cherish. It's the specter that tells us, everything you love will come to an end. And I, death, will be the one to claim it. But what if this fear, this existential anxiety that haunts every human being, is nothing but an illusion? What if everything we've been taught to believe about death is completely wrong? It's a question that has echoed through history, puzzling great minds like Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher whose thoughts on death can radically change the way we view our existence. He dared to challenge the very foundation of human fear, offering a perspective so profound that, if we truly embraced it, it could free us from the anxiety that shapes our lives. Epicurus boldly argued that death is nothing to fear. Imagine that. The thing that has terrified you for so long, the thing that keeps you awake at night, might not even exist in the way you think. Epicurus said, "Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not, and when death exists, we are not." A simple, yet mind-shattering statement. Now, take a moment to consider this. How many of your decisions, your choices, your daily actions are driven by the fear of death? How many of your anxieties, your insecurities, and your regrets are directly tied to the idea of your inevitable end? How many times have you avoided taking risks, chasing dreams, or even speaking your truth because you were scared of what might come after this life? Epicurus, however, would say that you are making an error. You are buying into a lie that has been passed down through generations. And if you let go of that fear, you'll be able to live a life more fully than you ever thought possible. But, you might ask, is it truly possible to live without fear of death? To confront your own mortality and remain unfazed? Is Epicurus simply a voice from the distant past offering comforting words, or is there something deeper to his philosophy that we've yet to fully understand? Let's dive deeper into this paradox, this mystery that has confounded humanity for thousands of years. Why do we fear the one thing that we have no control over, the one thing that is as natural as breathing? And more importantly, how can we break free from this shackling fear to live a life not dominated by the idea of death, but by the beauty of living? As we journey through Epicurus's revolutionary thinking, we'll uncover not just the myth that death is our enemy, but the truth that it's actually a liberating force, one that can free us from the anxieties that drain the meaning from our lives. And once we understand that, we'll begin to realize that the greatest freedom lies not in fearing death, but in embracing it for what it truly is, a part of the natural cycle of life. Are you ready to break free? Are you prepared to see death not as an enemy, but as a teacher, guiding you towards a life of greater joy, freedom, and fulfillment? If you are, then continue with me on this journey, and let's unravel the great mystery of death together. Before we get to that point of liberation, we need to understand why we fear death in the first place. What are the forces that have conditioned us to see it as something terrifying, something to avoid at all costs? Let's explore the unseen consequences of this fear, and how it silently shapes our lives in ways we don't even realize. Imagine, for a moment, that every time you feel a sense of dread creeping in, when that anxiety bubbles up in your chest, when you feel yourself holding back from life, when you hesitate at the edge of a new challenge, it's not just a random feeling. It's not just stress or the pressure of responsibility. No, it's something deeper, something older. It's the shadow of death, looming over you, making its presence known in ways you don't even recognize. It's easy to think of death as something that only strikes when we're near the end of our lives, something that comes as a single event, an isolated moment that separates us from everything we know. But death is more pervasive than that. It doesn't only haunt us in the abstract. It influences our every thought, every decision, often without us even realizing it. Neurologically, our brains are wired to react to the idea of death in ways that are hard to ignore. The fear of death, or what scientists call thanatophobia, is a primal instinct hardwired into our survival mechanisms. It's a part of the brain's fight-or-flight response, a protective mechanism designed to keep us alive. For most of human history, this instinct has been a necessary tool for survival. Fear of death made us cautious, alert, and able to avoid danger. But now, in the modern world, this once crucial survival instinct often morphs into something far more debilitating, a paralyzing anxiety that inhibits our ability to live freely. The fear of death is subtle, yet it is incredibly powerful. It doesn't only manifest in the form of existential dread or panic attacks, though those are obvious signs. It shows up in quieter, less noticeable ways, through hesitation, procrastination, or avoidance of difficult choices. It's the reason you might delay pursuing that passion project you've always dreamed of, or why you stay in a job you hate, or why you're afraid to speak your truth in relationships. The underlying thought is always the same. What if I take this risk and it leads to my downfall? What if this decision brings me closer to my death, my failure, my end? Think about the times in your life when you've made choices driven by comfort, by safety, by the desire to avoid pain. More often than not, these choices are based on the desire to stave off death in some form, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. In many ways, our society cultivates this fear by constantly bombarding us with images of mortality and loss. From advertisements to movies to news stories, we're shown over and over again that death is something to fear. It's not just a natural process, it's an enemy to be fought at all costs. But here's the thing, this fear doesn't make us live longer, or better, or more meaningfully. In fact, it does the opposite. It traps us in a cycle of avoiding discomfort, never venturing beyond what feels safe, and ultimately, never fully engaging with life. We become so consumed by our fear of death that we forget to actually live. Epicurus saw this very dynamic in ancient Greece. He recognized that most people's fear of death was driven by ignorance and misunderstanding. People feared the unknown, the idea of what might come after death. They feared the pain and suffering associated with the process of dying. But to Epicurus, these fears were irrational, rooted in misunderstandings about the nature of life and death itself. He believed that once we strip away these fears, once we realize that death is simply the cessation of consciousness and not a terrifying experience, we would no longer allow it to control our lives. This is where the paradox begins to take shape. The more we fear death, the more we let it control us. The more we avoid it, the more it shapes our decisions. And in doing so, we never truly experience the fullness of life. Ironically, it is only by embracing the reality of our mortality that we can begin to free ourselves from its grip. But breaking free from this fear isn't easy. It requires us to question everything we've been taught about death, to dismantle the cultural and psychological conditioning that has taught us to see death as a threat. It requires us to confront the fact that we will die, and to stop treating that fact like an enemy to be avoided at all costs. In the next section, we'll explore exactly how we can start to break free from this trap. We'll look at the radical shift in perspective that Epicurus and other great thinkers have suggested, a way of looking at death that doesn't make it our enemy, but instead, transforms it into something that can actually enhance our lives. Are you ready to rebel against this centuries-old fear? Ready to see death in a new light and free yourself from the chains that have bound you for so long? If so, then let's move forward and discover the path to liberation. If you could, would you choose to live free from the haunting grip of death? To experience a life unshackled from the paralyzing fear that quietly governs so much of what you do? Imagine waking up each day knowing that your time on this earth is limited, not with dread, but with a deep sense of purpose, of urgency, and, strangely, peace. This freedom is not as elusive as it might seem. And the key to unlocking it lies in embracing death, not as a fearsome, distant enemy, but as a natural, inevitable part of the life cycle. Epicurus provided us with a radical idea, one that is as much a challenge to modern sensibilities as it was to the ancient world: death is nothing to us. Once we understand this, once we accept that death is not a terrifying specter waiting to strike, we begin to dissolve the fear that has dictated much of our existence. And with that dissolution comes an unimaginable sense of freedom. But how do we make this shift? How do we stop seeing death as something to fear, and instead, start seeing it as simply another part of the world's natural order? The first step is a profound psychological shift, a radical reframing of how we view our own mortality. Epicurus teaches us that fear of death arises from the misunderstanding that death is something that happens to us while we are still conscious, that it is a painful, torturous experience. But death is, as he argued, simply the cessation of consciousness. When death arrives, we no longer exist to experience it. We are gone, and so, there is no suffering. Once we accept this, we can begin to live without the constant looming shadow of our inevitable end. This might seem counterintuitive at first. How can we live fully knowing that we will one day die? How can we accept death without allowing it to consume us? The answer, Epicurus suggests, lies not in avoidance or denial, but in acceptance. Death, like birth, is a natural part of life. We didn't choose our birth, and we won't choose our death. But, crucially, we have complete agency over how we live our lives in between. By recognizing the truth that death is not a threat but a transition, we free ourselves from the constant anxiety that stifles us. The fear of death holds us back from pursuing our desires, from facing our vulnerabilities, and from risking failure. Once we no longer fear death, we begin to see the world in a radically different way. We start to make choices based not on avoiding death but on living in alignment with what we truly value. Consider the lives of those who have broken free from the shackles of this fear. Think of the Stoics, people like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, who not only accepted their mortality but welcomed it. They knew that their time was finite, and yet they lived with a sense of purpose and discipline that many of us would envy. They didn't live in fear of death because they had already accepted it. They viewed death not as an enemy, but as a reminder to live with meaning and clarity. Even more striking are figures like Steve Jobs, who, facing his own death from cancer, spoke about how the knowledge of his mortality sharpened his vision for life. In his now legendary Stanford commencement address, Jobs shared a powerful insight: remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. In those words, Jobs echoed Epicurus's philosophy: death frees us to live more fully, to take risks, to pursue what we love, because once we realize that we're already naked, that is, already vulnerable and finite, there's nothing left to fear. By shedding our fear of death, we can begin to live more authentically, not because we are trying to outlast life, but because we realize that life's true value comes from living it fully, with no illusions of immortality. To truly break free, we must accept our finite nature. We must take our time seriously, make every moment count, and give ourselves permission to fully embrace the life we have, without obsessing over the end. The second step in this rebellion is to embrace death as a teacher. Rather than fearing it as the great interrupter of our lives, we can learn from it. Death teaches us that time is precious. It teaches us to prioritize what truly matters: relationships, experiences, passions, and personal growth, over trivial distractions or endless chasing of things that don't bring fulfillment. When we stop fearing death, we begin to value life in a deeper way, one that is less concerned with accumulation and more focused on meaning. This shift requires courage. It means letting go of the false comforts we've clung to in the name of security and facing life head-on. It requires questioning cultural norms that tell us to avoid thinking about death, to distract ourselves with entertainment or consumption. In a world that encourages us to ignore our mortality, the rebel is the one who confronts it. The key to breaking free, then, is in the acceptance of death as part of the human experience. Once you allow death to be a part of your reality, not something to run from, but something to live alongside, you unlock a new sense of freedom. You no longer live in the shadow of fear, but instead, in the light of purpose. Imagine what your life could look like if you approached each day as though it were your last, not in a despairing or fatalistic way, but with the understanding that your time is limited. You would no longer waste time on petty grudges or meaningless distractions. You would make decisions that align with your deepest desires. You would take chances, pursue your dreams, and savor the precious moments that make up this fleeting existence. This is the freedom Epicurus envisioned for us. It's the freedom that comes from acknowledging that death will come for all of us, but that it has no power over how we choose to live until then. And it is this understanding that sets the stage for the most profound realization of all. Having broken free from the grip of death, we now stand at the edge of a new reality. With our newfound perspective, we are ready to confront the ultimate truth, the deepest realization that will forever change how we experience life and death. Are you ready to discover it? To uncover the final, most powerful insight that will shift your entire worldview? Let's take that final step together. Now that we've broken free from the weight of death's shadow, it's time to confront the ultimate truth, the final, most profound realization that will not only transform how we see death, but also how we experience life itself. Are you ready to face this truth? Because this is where everything changes. It's a simple truth, but one that cuts deep. Death is not the end, but the beginning of a deeper understanding of life. When you let go of the fear of death, something remarkable happens. You stop living for death, and start living in life. You begin to understand that the very awareness of death's inevitability gives life its meaning. It is this awareness, this recognition that time is finite, that breathes urgency, richness, and purpose into every moment. This is the secret that Epicurus, and many of the world's greatest thinkers, understood. It is the knowledge of death that allows us to truly live. Think about it. Every culture, every philosophy, every religion speaks of death in one form or another. Yet, it is never the death itself that brings meaning, it is the life we create while we have the chance. The mortality of human beings, rather than diminishing the value of life, actually enhances it. Once you accept that death is not an end to be feared, but a natural transition to be embraced, life becomes more precious. It becomes something to be savored, something to be fully experienced without the nagging question of, what if I don't have enough time, or, what if I waste my life? In the moments when we truly grasp this truth, when we cease to view death as an external force coming to rob us of our time, we find that the paradox dissolves. Death no longer holds any power over us because we've learned to live with its presence, not in fear of it. In fact, the very thought of death can now become a source of strength, clarity, and motivation. Consider, for a moment, the greatest works of art, literature, and innovation throughout history. Many of these were born from the awareness of life's impermanence. Think of the poet who writes their final verses, the artist who paints their last masterpiece, the entrepreneur who launches a dream into the world knowing their time is finite. These are the people who embraced death, not by cowering from it, but by allowing it to push them to greatness. Steve Jobs' words from his Stanford commencement address continue to resonate. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. Jobs didn't simply acknowledge death, he used it. He used the knowledge that his time was limited to fuel his passion, to create products that would change the world. The same can be said for countless other visionaries, who, knowing their mortality, dared to push boundaries, create new ideas, and leave behind legacies. But here's the deeper revelation: the fear of death is not just a fear of the end, it is a fear of the unknown, a fear of the unfamiliar. Once we begin to see death not as the unknown, but as a natural part of the known, we reclaim the mystery of life itself. Death ceases to be something that looms over us, something to avoid or deny. Instead, it becomes part of the beautiful uncertainty of life that encourages us to explore, to risk, and to grow. This understanding doesn't come all at once. It takes time, introspection, and a willingness to confront what we most fear. But once it clicks, once you realize that death has no power to steal your life unless you give it that power, you are free. You are liberated from the greatest illusion humanity has ever been taught, that death is the enemy. Think about how your life would change if you embraced this truth fully. If every action you took was guided by the awareness that death is not something to fear, but something that propels you forward. If you saw each day as an opportunity, not to avoid death, but to live it fully. Imagine a life without regret, without the constant nagging fear of time running out, because you've already accepted that the time you have is yours to live completely, without reservation. The ultimate realization, the one that Epicurus tried to impart so long ago, is that death is not the thing that holds you back. It's the fear of it that does. And once you release that fear, once you step into the world with the full understanding that death will come when it does, but it will not define you, you unlock a freedom that cannot be taken away. Epicurus, Marcus Aurelius, and countless other thinkers all understood this. They knew that true peace comes not from denying death, but from accepting it. When you embrace your mortality, you realize that it is not a burden to carry, but a light to guide you toward the most meaningful life possible. And so, this is the challenge: will you continue to live in fear of the one certainty in life, or will you choose to live in the awareness of it, using it to propel you into a fuller, richer existence? The choice, as always, is yours. As you walk forward, remember this: death is not something to be feared. It is a part of the grand symphony of life, a chapter that will inevitably come, but not before you have written your own story. The power lies not in escaping death, but in fully living while you still can. Let that knowledge be your freedom, your guide, your motivation. Embrace it, and you'll discover that life, the precious, fleeting life you have, is far more meaningful than you ever imagined.